£350 million has been made available to cut emissions in heavy industry and to drive economic recovery from coronavirus. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, said, "This is why we're bringing together government, business and investors in a groundbreaking new partnership, because climate change is one of the greatest challenges that we face today." And Grant Shapps, I'm delighted to say, joins me now on the line. Grant, it's faced you for rather a long time. Never have you been in a more precarious financial position. Why are you doing it now?
Well, so I think actually precisely because by doing it now, we can build out of this downturn into recovery with new technology, which we can then sell to the rest of the world.
Is it a conscious decision to bring it forward? Because, Keynesian economics say, if government spends money on things that matter, the net good is huge and great. Have you consciously brought this forward?
Yeah, not as a sort of great kind of hint, sort of a nod to Keynesianism or anything else, but simply because we'd already, remember, in this country committed to getting to net zero, so not producing any carbon from our economy by 2050.
Yeah.
And to do that, we've got to do a whole bunch of things. We need to make sure that heavy industry isn't polluting, that transport isn't polluting. And one of the things that I'm launching with the Prime Minister today, the Jet Zero Council, our attempt, a moonshot, if you like, to ensure that we can fly commercial aircraft, become the first country in the world to fly commercial aircraft across the Atlantic without contributing to greenhouse gases. So a lot of research, a lot of technology, and that's what we're bringing together in the Jet Zero Council today. Who
did you have to disappoint in this package? Because 139 million for heavy industry, 149 million innovative materials, etc. I'm the last person to be wanting to spend taxpayers' money unnecessarily. But the actual numbers are not that headline grabbing in the context of the other challenges you're facing. Who did you have to say, no, not this time?
Well, this is the latest stage in a very long-running programme to ensure that we are getting to the front of the race to decarbonise our economy. And by the way, a race that Britain's been winning. We have seen a huge reduction in carbon in this country. We lead the world in the league table on this, while still increasing the size of our economy. So we've done very well up until the coronavirus. We all know the impact that that's had on our economy. We want to make sure coming out the other side, we're sort of, perhaps rocket boosters is the wrong phrase to use, zero carbon rocket boosters.
Well, as long as they're green rockets. Yeah. But actually, that, funnily enough, that takes me to the point. You're leading on this morning. I know Alok Sharma, who's business secretary, has spoken about it as well. But is the fact that you're leading essentially not an admission but a confirmation by the government that transportation is at the pounding heart of our decarbonisation challenge, whether it's heavy lorries on the motorways or even the electricity being generated to power trains and the rest of it? Transport is our biggest single problem.
It is. I mean, it's a very wise sort of kind of recognition, because it was the case that things like energy production were the most polluting parts of our economy. What's happened, though, of course, is we've ended up with all of this renewable energy. I remember the figures that started to come through saying we're producing over half our energy on renewable sources, and we want to go all the way. And actually now transport has become the single biggest polluter, 30%, perhaps a third of the economy. Greenhouse gases comes from transport. So it's not by coincidence that we're leading this press, for example, to get to zero carbon car uses, electric cars and the rest of it, but also it's for technologies for areas that haven't been invented yet, including on electric and zero carbon flight, which is a massive challenge for this country. But if we can get ahead of it, we can export it to the rest of the world. So there's good reasons for doing this.
Okay, let me put it in some broader context now as well. I was talking just a moment ago to Peter Dowd, former shadow chief secretary to the Treasury for Labour, and he was saying there were times post-war when our national debt, not the deficit, but the total global lump, was equivalent to 200% of GDP. It's now approaching 100% and probably will be that in the spring. Here's you getting another 350 billion. Let me put it to you quite bluntly. Is there no limit to the amount of money this government will borrow to get us out of the economic downside of coronavirus?
We had 350 million rather than billion on this.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
350
million
today. But you're absolutely right about the sort of, the quantum figures are very large. And look, I take my lead on this from people like the Bank of England, the Office of National Statistics, both of whom have indicated that if we hadn't done this big package, sort of put our arms around the British people, the British economy, we would have a much tougher job recovering from this. In fact, one of the most interesting studies I've seen is by the OECD, who've said that the UK is in line to bounce back slightly faster and better, because we wait to see if this all happens, than some of our competitors, because we have had such comprehensive packages.
And just for those who, unlike you and me, aren't anoraks, OECD, an international, the Office of Economic Development and Cooperation, that's a global thing, not
that's
a
UK global body, and they look at all economies around the world, and they look at all the responses that different governments have been making, and have said that, if only marginally, that our approach to this should, in the longer run, mean that we are able to save more jobs, get back on our feet quicker, and so on and so forth. But I don't want to underestimate the sheer scale of what we're up against, Alastair, because we know that this is going to be the challenge of our times to get this economy back on its feet. It's one of the reasons the Prime Minister was saying, OK, we've got the virus somewhat under control. We need to keep pushing down on it, and we need to get our economy started again to protect jobs in the longer term.
Yeah. Peter Dowd also said that you were slow off the mark with your economic reaction. And several in the city say that as well. It's not just political point scoring. Is what you're doing today a part of really putting the foot metaphorically on the accelerator, but hoping because it's an electric power car, it will not pollute the environment?
I really have to take issue with that. If you think right back to the early days of this crisis and those press conferences, one of the very first ones was, in fact, possibly even the first, I can't recall, but right at the beginning, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, was out there outlining unprecedented support. I mean, the kind of thing we've never seen in this country, and world beating in terms of the furlough scheme, which has protected millions and millions of jobs. Things like the various different loan schemes, the bounce back loans, money to the hospitality sector. I know it's very easy to say, nothing is ever going to be enough. And it is true to say we can't protect every single job and every single business. But the size and the scale of response, I think, is quite hard to argue against. What is it? 9.4 million people's jobs protected through the furlough program. I mean, this is not small beer.
No, I understand that.
Today is looking to the future. You're right about that. But I would take issue with the idea that we're somehow late to the game of protecting jobs in the economy.
But if you have to avoid 200% of national debt, then that's partly why Rishi and the others are unwinding that furlough scheme, albeit saying we'll give you £1,000 if you take the person back to work and what have you. You have to make a decision, and I'm talking to you now as a member of the Cabinet rather than just as Transport Secretary. A point comes where you blow the whistle and say, thus far and no further. How close are we to that point in terms of the big numbers?
Well, October specifically on the furlough scheme, because the Chancellor's already announced that is when it ends, and it starts to.
Because you can't afford it to be open-ended. You can't afford it to be open-ended.
I mean, look, who listening to this thinks that you could just have salaries paid forever by borrowing money? Of course, that's just not possible. I think in the short term, it's very important to make sure that the economy's still there to bounce back, and hopefully that is what's been achieved. But you're right, there's a finite distance to this. It will complete in October. There is then a further incentive, as you say, after 3 months, of money to employers who take employees back. But it will need to come to an end. But then there are other things that we're doing. As I say, the announcement today on looking at our green transport and industrial future is all part of that.
Okay, final question to you, and I want you to, as it were, put the specific transport hat back on. Not that you've taken it off, but you know what I'm getting at. I came up to London on Sunday night on South West trains, first time in ages for obvious reasons and what have you. And I know it was Sunday night and what have you, but the numbers, passenger numbers generally, Monday to Friday, let alone the weekend, are low. Have you got any early indication of how much it's going to cost you, the government, and us, the taxpayers, so that you don't have to look at the Network Rail system and say, this is a busted flush, we can't keep it going? Because obviously you've got to keep it going. But how much is that going to cost you, Grant?
Yeah. Well, early indication was £3.5 billion, which is what it costs to put the emergency measures in place to keep our public transport running in order that we could get all the key workers to hospitals and healthcare settings during the height of this crisis. So that's the initial cost to it. Look, the public transport system, particularly the rails, weren't running as they should do. I've used them for years. I'm frustrated as the next person about late trains, cancellations, and the rest of it. So it was ripe to sort out that system anyway. Quite a lot of work had already gone into it. And this coronavirus will actually provide us with a sort of a leap forward in terms of being able to move to the next setup, which will be a less fragmented railway. Right now, it's in too many parts. It's too difficult to work out whose fault it is when the train is late. And we're going to bring it together, still have the enterprise in there, but bring it together. And as passenger numbers pick up, I intend to develop an excellent world-class railway where the trains run on time, are reliable, and that will help bring people back as well.